Okay, we're going to learn a little bit of Pirkei Avot. We're at the first chapter, second Mishnah. Shimon HaTzadik, already there's something interesting there. Shimon is called HaTzadik, the righteous one. And this may sort of foreshadow a little bit about what Shimon is going to say. What exactly is a tzaddik? As far as I can tell, he's like the only sage that is given this title, HaTzadik, the righteous one. Certainly there were others who were very righteous as well. What does it mean to be a tzaddik, the righteous one? So I think part of the answer might be connected to an insight that can be found also with regards to Yosef. Yosef is also called a tzaddik. Yosef a tzaddik. Why not Abraham? Why not Isaac? Jacob, certainly they were righteous people as well. And so an insight that I remember delving into when we are on the Parsha dealing with Yosef is that Yosef was different in that he was the first one really not to have God speaking to him directly. God speaks to Abraham, God speaks to Yitzchak and Yaakov. They see the amazingness nature of the world and they see God in this world, but they have almost a leg up in that they have a relationship with God. Yosef doesn't have that same clarity. And yet, in spite of that, we see again and again and again, he sees God, right? He doesn't sin against Potiphar's wife because it would be a great sin against God. He forgives the brothers because this is what God wants. Everywhere he turns, he sees God's involvement in his daily mundane life, which is not always so easy to see when one doesn't have that same incredibly intimate relationship with God that Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov did have, and others as well. And so I'd like to suggest that's perhaps what it means to be a tzaddik, is to be able to see God, feel God, act with total conviction in God, in spite of not having the same clarity of that relationship with God. And if that's true, then perhaps that lends us some insight into Shimon. Shimon HaTzadik is, in a sense, a transitional figure. There's an argument of which Shimon we're referring to. There's a Shimon that is the last of the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, that perhaps is those that returned from Bavel after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, and were there also for the building of the second Beit HaMikdash. And then there is also a later Shimon, I'm not sure which Shimon per se, but is during the time where there's much greater Greek involvement and the Hellenization is taking place throughout Israel. In either event, we see that Shimon represents a person who is living in a changed period of time where there are outside influences, where the security of the Jewish people is not as guaranteed as it once might have been. He did not live during the time where the Beit HaMikdash was on solid footing. He did not live when the national sovereignty was a guaranteed thing, but rather was always under threat, could be questioned, or just recently experienced a great loss. And so Shimon's advice should be taken in that context and realize that perhaps there are certain things we need to do differently because of the reality in which we're in. And we'll see more of that as we go forward, but I just want to at least put that out there as a possible contextual consideration. So Shimon HaTzadik, he was amongst those Misharei Knesset Gdolah, amongst the remaining ones of the Knesset Gdolah. Some say he was amongst the very last. Some say that he was actually in the midst of the group. Hu haya omer, he used to say. This is different than we often see where it says Hu amar, Hem amru, they said. Hu haya omer means he was always saying. This was something that symbolized who he was. It was not a one-time thing. It was something that he repeated fairly often. And I think that's symbolic of Torah in general, that Pirkei Avot is trying, again, to enable us to successfully integrate the values of Torah into our life. And by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the editor of Pirkei Avot, writing Hu haya omer, he used to say, he was accustomed saying, he's giving us the permission to realize that Torah has to be repeated. Even the exact same thing, that just learning something one time, even if you know it intellectually, is not enough. It's something that you have to be constantly reminded of. It was Alexander Pope who once said, "Nothing is sufficiently learned that is not, nothing is sufficiently repeated that is never sufficiently learned." Torah is a way of life, and living is not something just intellectual that you can keep in the back of your mind. It's something that has to be at the forefront of your mind because it influences your actions on a daily basis, and therefore it's something that has to be repeated in a sense. Interesting that I mentioned Alexander Pope because Shimon has a connection to the name Alexander to begin with. The story is told that Alexander the Great comes and conquers the whole area. This would suggest perhaps it's the later Shimon. He conquers the entire area, and Shimon Tzaddik actually welcomes him. They have a friendship, and Alexander the Great asks to put a statue of himself inside the Beit HaMikdash. So this is not something that Shimon Tzaddik can allow and tolerate, to put a statue of a human being in the midst of the Beit HaMikdash. It violates a whole series of different principles, but at the same time, he doesn't want to offend Alexander the Great, not the least of which that he is the ruler of the free, I shouldn't say the free world, the ruler of the world on some levels, and someone you want to keep on your side. And so he comes up with the idea of saying that all boys born to priests, Shimon Tzaddik appears to be a Kohen. His father was the Kohen Gadol, in fact, according to some interpretations, that he says all of the Kohanim that give birth to sons that year, they will name their children Alexander. That is how today there are many Jews with the name Alexander, despite the fact that it doesn't appear as a traditionally Jewish name. It's really a Greek name, but that's the source of it all. This connection with Greek, I've already alluded to, and we'll see it in other examples as well. Actually, just as another brief aside, he's one of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. We know that assembly by a different name. We know it as the Sanhedrin. Well, the Sanhedrin is also a Greek word. So the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah were not members of the Sanhedrin, even though the body served a similar purpose, because that's the more traditional Jewish body. It's only after the influence of Greek society on Israel that the name changes to Sanhedrin. And so we see also that transitional element of the impact of the outside world. And that impact of the outside world is something to consider. So, Hu Haya Omer, he used to say, Al Shlosha Dvarim HaOlam Omed, on three things the world stands, Al HaTorah, Yal HaAvodah, Yal Gemilut Chasadim, on the Torah, on Avodah, often translated today as labor, but Avot Rabbi Natan and others point out Avodah means the service in the Beit HaMikdash. It's that type of meaning. There are others who will disagree and say, and this relates to the transitional nature of what we're dealing with, Avodah, right, as the Rambam writes, there is no such thing as Avodah except Avodat Belev, when it says that you shall serve God with all your heart. So serving God with all your heart, that's prayer. That's how the subsequent rabbis interpret that. And so the other possible explanation is not that we're talking specifically about the Beit HaMikdash, the service is there, but rather prayer in general, tefillah in general. It makes sense that it was one of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah because that was one of the great innovations, right after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, in order to make sure that we keep Judaism alive. The men of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, as we've mentioned before, had to innovate and had to envision a Judaism where we are not necessarily living in sovereignty with our own Beit HaMikdash. And so if the Beit HaMikdash could be destroyed, as it was before we left Eretz Israel, and then would have seen the desolation as we returned, how do you keep these same values alive? So in the Beit HaMikdash example, the rabbis suggested, well, we move some of the values and some of the goals that were engaged in the Beit HaMikdash to other places. So the singing of the Levites, the Levi'im, as we would bring our sacrifices, that was moved to the family Shabbat table, where they would be singing on Shabbat. The Shabbat table, to begin with, is an innovation. It, in many respects, is the altar right? It is the altar that we no longer have in the Beit HaMikdash. So some of those values of trying to connect closer to God, to transform the physical into something spiritual, food into holiness, it takes place now at the Shabbat table. We invite guests over. The table becomes our altar. Other forms of transference, the eternal flame that was used for the sacrifices in the Beit HaMikdash becomes the eternal light in the synagogue itself. And the largest, of course, innovation is that the service inside the Beit HaMikdash becomes prayer, without the karbanot, but we would call the karbanot, and we have tefillah in its place. We have prayer in its place, and so we understand both understandings of the word avodah. The original certainly is the Beit HaMikdash and the services that take place there, but also the rabbinic innovation to ensure that Judaism continues to survive also is understood in the word avodah, of prayer. Yal gimilut chasadim. Here too, in acts of kindness. Here too, there seems to be a transformation of sorts. There are some who suggest the original meaning of gimilut chasadim were acts of piety, acts of loyalty. If you look into the work by Judah Golden called "The Three Pillars of Simeon the Righteous," is an article that he presented at the American Academy of Jewish Research. He argues that the original meaning was more religious, right? That gimilut, or the word gama, means to repay something, to feel a sense of loyalty and bound, and it applied to all the mitzvot that one would perform, not specifically those between human beings, but also our ritual mitzvot as well. And therefore, he viewed the original understanding of these three items, Torah, Chasadim, and Avodah, were very ritualistic and very religious in that sense of the word. But they expanded, thanks to the rabbinic innovation, also led to a certain extent by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and that Gimilut Chasadim, it had to be expanded and focused more on interpersonal relations so that it would be of greater relevance to the people. Whether or not the original meaning he ascribes to Gimilut Chasadim that was more ritualistic, I'm not certain or necessarily convinced, but it's an interesting idea. But certainly, Gimilut Chasadim is not simply chesed, not simply kindness to others. There is a uniquely Jewish element to it. The classic examples of Gimilut Chasadim are things like visiting the sick, hosting people for meals, bringing joy to the bride, participating in free loan society, right? Gamach is an abbreviation of Gimilut Chasadim, is clothing the naked and helping with funeral preparations and costs. Indeed, we're told that Chesed is the signature of God, that God begins the Torah with clothing the naked, right? Adam and Eve need to be clothed by God. At the center of the Torah is feeding the hungry. There's the story of the man, how Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, feeds the Jews while in the desert. And then finally, of course, when Moshe passes away, he is buried by the kiss of God. And so we see that God is engaged in chesed, and so too are we commanded to do so. And there is a Jewish element of that, in the sense that there's a deeper responsibility of when one is part of the same nation, part of the same community, part of the same family. There's an obligation to give a free loan, for example, without any interest to a fellow Jew, to a fellow citizen, but you don't necessarily have that same obligation to someone outside of your community. And similarly, that Gimilut Chasadim suggests, I think, not just a general blanket form of kindness and chesed, but a very expansive, but ultimately limited to one's nation. I'll explain why I'm focusing on that particularly in just a little bit. But before I do so, let me also just explain a few of the rabbinic understandings of chesed, Gimilut Chasadim, because the Tosefta points out that this also is not just the same as tzedakah, as charity. Um, uh, there's at least three major differences that are always important to remember. One of them is that chesed can be done with both money as well as one's body, one's time. Tzedakah is just with money, but with chesed, you can invite someone over to a meal, you can visit them in the hospital. Right? It's not just monetary assistance that one provides with chesed. This perhaps alludes to another difference. You can engage in chesed with those who are poor as well as those who are rich. It's, again, not a financial matter. There could be someone elderly who's quite wealthy who could benefit tremendously from company. So there's no financial aspect per se to chesed. It's giving who you are. It's your body. But Moshe Feinstein points out that just as there's an obligation to give 10% of your income for charitable purposes, one should try and aspire to give 10% of their time for the same charitable type of purposes. And the other major distinction that Tosefta points out is that chesed can be done with the living as well as the dead. Where tzedakah, charity, can only be given to those who are alive. You visit, go to a person's funeral, you help with them, help with their burial. It's called the chesed shel emet, the only true form of chesed, because you're not going to get any type of recompense for this, anything in return. So there also is one of the distinctions of chesed. So these are the three things that Rabbi Shimon Tzadok says. I think I'd like to make two general points about the three things that he suggests help the world be sustained. One of them is, again, a historical contextual point. We've spoken a lot about Greek influence and how it was growing during this time period. It is possible that this is a polemic against that influence. When Shimon Tzadok says the world stands on three things, the olam he was talking about is maybe not just the whole world, the creation of the world. There are many who interpret it as the creation of the world, and that says the world was only created if there's be Torah learning, if there will be either tefillah or the fulfillment of the temple service, or gemilut chasadim, that it's for these things that the world was created, that they should take place in the world. But others point out that it's not the whole world, that it's the age in which we are living, this world. This world stands on three things, and these three things are in contradistinction to the Greek understanding, right? Greeks and Hellenism were suggesting there's a new type of wisdom out there, a secular wisdom, that many Jews, of course, were buying into and accepting at the expense of their traditional Torah wisdom. And so he argues, Shimon Tzadok, saying, the world stands, our world needs to remember the importance of Torah, that it's not something that we give up on so easily. And so he therefore indeed does focus on Torah in contradistinction to what we call Chachmat Yavan, the wisdom of the Greeks. Similarly, the avoda, whether it's the temple service or the prayer, is also in contradistinction to what he would view as the avodah zara, the pagan worship of Greek worship services. And so therefore he's saying, make sure you're not so seduced by this new powerful Greek world, this very attractive, right? If you know the story of Hanukkah, there was great attraction that Hellenism offered the Jewish people, and many, in fact, indeed were influenced and moved away from traditional values. And Shimon Tzadok's three statements is response to that. And so too with gemilut chasadim, perhaps in the expanded Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai understanding that Greek culture could be cruel. There are those who point out that if there was a deformed child, they would allow nature to take its course and put them out on the rocks and allow animals and birds to peck and kill that poor baby because it was not beautiful in the Greek understanding of what beauty is all about. And so the Torah values come forth and say, remember that we have these obligations. These are religious obligations in terms of our relationship with other people. So that's one way of looking at Shimon HaTzaddik's point. There's another thing that I'd like to suggest also, and I admit fully that I'm reading into Shimon HaTzaddik. One of the things that people often ask is at the end of Pirkei Avot, the first chapter, it's as if Pirkei Avot was bookended by these two ideas. There's another Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, who says the world rests on three things as well. Not rests, that's the wrong word. Kayam, it is maintained, it is sustained on three things. And those three things, Shimon ben Gamliel, this is Mishnah Yudchet, number 18. Al shloshad varim ha'olam omed. I'm sorry. The world stands on three things. Al hadin v'al emet v'al ha'shalom. Shenemar emet mishpat shalom shiftu b'ashrechem. That's actually a surprise for me. I remember it differently as Kayam. The world is sustained on three things. But here it's the same Omed. I will have to look into that if in fact that is the case. Yes, indeed. I'm now looking at the notes. I'm reading now from the Mishnayot of Avot, the Kahati edition, but in many of the other editions, it has a different girsa, different words. And indeed, I'm now looking in the notes here. Kahati's comment is the Yesh Gorsim, and there are those that read it differently, of Kayam. That will become significant in a moment, but the larger question is, how can Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel disagree with someone who's come before him, Rabbi Shimon HaTzaddik, who says the world requires Torah, Avodah, V'Dinut, Chasadim for its existence, and now Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel seems to offer three different options: din, justice, emet, truth, and shalom, and peace. How do we understand these differences? So a practical difference that some have suggested, very simply, is that, as I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Shimon HaTzaddik was talking about the merit. The merit of these things is what inspired the world we created. God looks and says, if there will be Torah learning, and there will be a Beit HaMikdash, and there will be Gemut Chasadim, then indeed these three things will exist. The world is worthwhile to bring the world into place. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, on the other hand, was talking about practical survival of the world. If you don't have a justice system, people will do whatever they want, and they want to just go about and killing and robbing and doing all these terrible things. If you don't have justice to stop that, so then the world won't be able to be sustained. Philosophically, theologically, the world can be created if there's Torah, but if there's not these other things, then on a practical level, the world will not remain in existence, or certainly not a place that one would want to be very proud of. Similarly, with shalom, creating peace amongst people, as well as emet, truth. That if truth and reality is not a concern, then the world ultimately collapses. I'd like to offer an additional explanation of the difference between these two ideas. But let me preface it by saying one thing that perhaps should be included previously. I should have included previously, which is just the relationship between Torah, Avodah, V'Dinut, Chasadim. Perhaps it's obvious, and maybe that's why I pass over it quickly, but I think it's worthwhile saying that Torah, Avodah, V'Dinut, Chasadim are the three pillars of Judaism. And perhaps the reason why Shimon HaTzaddik, who is one of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, felt he had to start with these ideas, is because the focus of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, if you remember their first statement, was primarily Torah. We should be careful in our judgment. We should put a fence around the Torah. We have to protect the Torah, raise many students of Torah. Right? It seemed to be focused primarily on Torah, and for good reason, because Torah, and so on, and get this prepared in exile. Shimon HaTzaddik is telling us, as important as Torah is, make sure you see the full picture of Torah. Right? Torah without an improved relationship with God, avodah, prayer, or without an improved relationship with other human beings is not really Torah. Torah has to lead to ma'asim, to good deeds. When we recite in the morning, we make a blessing over Torah, in fact, and then immediately after that, we do some learning. Right? Whenever you do a bracha, a blessing, you immediately then engage in the act of that blessing. So you make a blessing of the lighting candles, you light the candles. You make a blessing of the lulav and nectar, you shake the lulav and nectar. So you make a blessing of Torah. What Torah should you be learning? So one of my favorite insights is the Tiferet Shlomo, who notes that the source from the Torah we immediately learn has to do with blessings. It's the priestly blessings. Right? May God bless you and keep you. And yes, why of all the Torah we could perhaps learn after making a blessing of Torah, we learn specifically that one. And his answer is you need to know that your Torah has to lead to blessing. And that's why we learned that specific item. The other things we learn, right, that's from the Torah itself. We then learn a piece from the Mishnah, and we then learn a piece from the Gemara. The piece from the Mishnah speaks about a few different items. Peah, the mitzvah of living in the corners of our fields and appearing in the Yerushalayim, coming up to Jerusalem for the holidays. And then also Talmud Torah is one of the important ideas that's listed. And then when we get to the Mishnah, the Talmud speaks of other things that are important to engage in. Hachnasat Orchim, things we've already mentioned, Bikur Cholim, Hachnasat Chatan V'Kala, helping the bride and the groom, making her happy, visiting the sick, comforting the bereaved. There are a whole series of mitzvot that are mentioned. And then it says, the Talmud Torah connected Kulam. And the first understanding that one has when you read that is that Talmud Torah is greater than all of them. Connected Kulam, it's more equal than all of them put together. And I think it's not really that they're on a scale. I think that they're more on a spectrum. That is to say that Talmud Torah is what enables all of these. You may not know the right way to do an act of chesed, an act of kindness, without the studying of Torah. You may not know that this person deserves your kindness, or you give a person money, but you embarrass them in the process, whereas Torah would ensure that you do it in a much more sensitive way. Similarly, in terms of our relationships with God, Torah helps us know and learn the best ways of relating to God. That it's not just whatever we're feeling, but we also have certain theological principles that we need to adhere to. And so Torah is what reminds us constantly to do mitzvot, and the study of Torah reminds us. And in addition, it guides us what exactly those deeds should be. And so it's a comprehensive balancing of learning Torah that enables us to also pray and also do actions. They are connected together, and one is to live a balanced life. If you only learn Torah and it never leads to actions, obviously that's a failure. Similarly, if you only are doing a prayer but not connected to Torah study, not connected to engaging in positive relationships with other people, it's also a failed form of fulfillment of Judaism. And also with regard to giving Chassidim, there's obviously great benefit in still being a good person and kindness and sharing all these things. But without Torah, perhaps it's not done in the optimal way it can be, and Torah will inspire you to even take it to higher levels, even if you have a natural intuition. And so they're all together in that regard. Let us return now, as I said, that's something that probably should have been said earlier. Let us return now to one other answer to the question between the early and the late Shimons, the early statement of what the world requires, Torah, Avodah, Chassidim, and the last ones, which is about 200 to 300 years later, when it was said, of Din, Emet, and Shalom. So what many people point out, that, and we'll maybe speak more about this when we get to that, number 18, Reverend Shimon ben Gamliel, is that really on some level, his are sort of similar and parallel to Reverend Shimon ben Gamliel's statements. But I think we have to go a step further than that. And for that, I want to share with you an insight of a scholar, a legal scholar by the name of Robert Cover, He wrote in the 1980s in a Harvard Law Review article. He was a professor at Yale University. He was not an Orthodox Jew, to the best of my knowledge, but he certainly had a very warm spot for traditional Judaism. And he wrote a legal law review article about a whole series of different things, about something called nomos and narrative, and how laws are enforced, and how laws inspire. Um, and there's a lot of very fascinating, interesting stuff in the article as well. Just one thing I want to focus on for our purposes. He begins the article, interestingly enough, by looking at this question of the difference between Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik and then Shimon ben Gamliel. And he quotes Rav Yosef Karo, of all people. And he says, Rav Yosef Karo argues that there are two different worlds being discussed by these two different rabbis. In the first instance, Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik is describing a world where people are more cohesive. He calls it a world-creating vision. You see, in order to create something, create a society in a very powerful way, there has to be cohesiveness amongst the people. There has to be a real connection. And Yosef Karo says that's what Torah, that's what the temple service, that's what Gemilut Chassidim, the acts of kindness between people of the same community is all about. And that's what was taking place. The Jewish people during the time of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. I mentioned, of course, that there was a growing Greek influence in the world, but he still remembers the time of the Beit HaMikdash, and he sees the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash and the glory of that experience, and living in one's own land. He just returned, or he was amongst the people who returned. And so therefore, the society that he's arguing to be created has to be founded on values that the community shares very powerfully. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is after. He's witnessed the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash. He has witnessed the dispersion. He has witnessed the weakening of the Jewish people. They're now heavily influenced by the Romans as well. And he says, in order to maintain now, something different is called upon. He says now we have the requirement of a world maintaining philosophy. And he says that has to be expanded. It can't be as unique. That has to be things like terms that others can understand as well. Let me now use Robert Cover's language to describe his understanding of what Yosef Karo says. He says in the modern liberal world, we can't have what he calls a pidaic society. This is the world creating society. You can't, there are so many different people, there's so many different values, so many different communities. They don't all share the exact same unique, intimate experiences. And so therefore, in order to allow people to survive and live together, to coexist, to have whole communities coexist in one legal system, you have the world maintaining values. What he calls an imperial society. An empire in the days of old would have many different countries under its rule, and it had to allow sort of the uniqueness of each society. But when they came together in the empire, they all had to somehow merge their different unique experience to a common ground, and therefore you had to expand and loosen what that might mean. And so concepts like truth, that's something that everyone can relate to, maybe slightly different and unique, but everyone can relate to. Concepts of peace, concept of justice. These are more generic terms that hold societies together when they're very different, but they can sort of relate to all these ideas. And he says, in terms of law, you need law to enforce these values because people don't necessarily have the same immediate frame of reference of what's important. But they can say, if it comes from the law, we will follow when it's enforced. The word creating societies, he calls a pedaic, which is interesting, using the Greek word about education. But he says these pedaic societies are much more cohesive, right? They feel like brothers and sisters, that there's a cohesiveness amongst the people. There's a cohesiveness in their vision. Um, you also don't have to enforce the laws. Right? People want to follow the laws so long as you provide education, that they bought into the system. And so education becomes very important. And in fact, following the laws is almost a correlation of the degree to the education that they have. This seems to be what Rabbi Shimon Tzaddik is advocating. He says, we have Torah, unique learning of our Torah, not general ideas of being good, but our Torah and our Talmud Torah, a study of our unique laws. And our Beit HaMikdash, our Tefillah, right? Again, these are unique things. Gemilut Chasidim, as I mentioned, is acts of kindness, but perhaps reserved for one's immediate community. And so there's tremendous cohesiveness. And he says, if you want to build a world, if you want to create a society, you need these type of cohesive features. You can't bring together people who have nothing in common, don't have a shared value, to build something really powerful and meaningful. But over time, these societies have to interact with other societies, and sometimes they split amongst themselves because they have slightly different vision of what is the truth. So how do these now different societies live together? And that's what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel offers, is this more world maintaining. There's a greater pluralism that exists. I'll just give you one example of how that might play out on a practical matter, and perhaps to see the beauty of using this type of analysis of Robert Cover to help explain the modern state of Israel. One of the papers I wrote once had to do with the concept of the Ger Toshav. The Ger Toshav is the biblical understanding of how the Jewish people have to relate to non-Jews living in their land. Now, there is this obligation based upon the principle of the Ger Toshav that the Jewish people have to provide certain benefits to these non-Jews. Obviously, the non-Jews have certain obligations as well. Some say it's the 7 laws of Noah. Some say it's simply an avoidance of avodah zarah, idol worship. Some say it's a fulfillment of many of the mitzvot in the Torah. Whatever the actual case is, I want to focus more on the Jewish obligation. And the Ramban writes this Jewish obligation to non-Jews in one's territory. Right? Specifically, it's an obligation almost of citizenship. It's an obligation because the person lives in my territory, I have to provide for them. There are certain health obligations that I have to provide for, certain financial, economic, and the like. I don't have that same obligation to a non-Jew living outside of my territory. It's because I'm a sovereign that I have this obligation. Now, Jews are dispersed throughout the world, and a different form of relating to non-Jews developed based on what I would call Darchei Shalom, Mipnei Darchei Shalom, Mipnei Eva. There's a few different principles. They appear in the Mishnah, Gemara, and Gittin. Basically, they say that you have a certain obligation to have good relations with non-Jews. And this is elevated to an even higher level in the Middle Ages, when the Miri reminds us or informs us that we're no longer dealing with pagans, we're dealing with non-Jews who actually follow beliefs in God and fundamental ethical principles. You have a certain obligation for good relations with non-Jews because that's the way of the Torah. The way of the Torah is to create peace between people. And so therefore you have certain obligations to maintain that. This other form, Darchei Shalom, the ways of peace, doesn't necessarily say I have an obligation to this non-Jew because of anything unique in my personal experience, but rather I have an obligation because we should have good relationships. And therefore good relations require me to look at the non-Jew a certain way, in a positive way that I otherwise might not. So for the 2,000 years of the diaspora, most of how we related to the non-Jews had to do with this concept of Darchei Shalom, or even Mipnei Eva. Mipnei Eva was that if one of our behaviors might somehow offend a non-Jew, we should be careful. because we want to have these good relationships with people. And so that also influenced the halacha. The halacha might say that I don't have a certain obligation to a non-Jew, but then it is superseded by the concept of darchei shalom or pirkei eva, that I have the obligation after all, not because I specifically have an obligation to this non-Jew, whether it's, let's say, giving charity or something akin to that. I have the obligation because I have to have a good relationship, but there's not an intrinsic obligation to give charity to, let's say, a non-Jew, or if we go back to some of the other items we spoke about. So which is better in relating to non-Jews? Is it better that it's an obligation, an inherent obligation, because I'm a sovereign, I have to take care of this non-Jew? Or is it, I don't really have an obligation, but in order to have peace, I should create the obligation? They're different. So, for example, darchei shalom exists universally. Right? I have this obligation towards non-Jews wherever they may exist in the world, whereas ger toshav only exists in Israel alone. So on some levels, you might say darchei shalom is better, but there are other levels that ger toshav is better. It's a more powerful obligation. I see these differences as parallel to what we've been talking about in Robert Grover's piece, that darchei shalom is a world-maintaining type of value. It's how different societies can get along with one another. But it's not strong enough in and of itself to create a cohesive nature. Ger toshav, that's a more powerful, because we're living on the same land, we have an obligation as a sovereign. It's a more powerful idea. One of the things I find so special about returning to Israel after 2,000 years is that we are not handcuffed to take one position or the other. We can actually go to a higher level. The biblical understanding was ger toshav. The diaspora understanding was darchei shalom. Returning to Israel, we can add to what we've already gained for 2,000 years of darchei shalom. We shouldn't get rid of it, but we can add to that the return to the ger toshav. And then when we have both ideas together, there's, I think, an even more powerful and rich perspective on this particular issue. That's just one example, and we could go into it much more in depth, obviously. The general point that I want to make is that Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik is saying that we need tight cohesiveness, rooted in our land, rooted in our unique Torah, rooted in our temple service. Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik says we're going to have to somehow learn to live with the rest of the world, and we have to expand these ideas so they can have application to the rest of the world. That our unique temple service is not going to have an application to a person living in Uganda or Iowa. But Judaism wants to have an influence there as well. And so therefore he says, let's find the parallel in a universal language of din, shalom, and emet. But of course, you have to have the original. You can't create something meaningful if you don't yet have the original. And so therefore we have to be looking in both directions at all times. We have to be looking inwards to make sure that we strengthen our connection to the original unique values of Judaism, and then also look outwards of how we can apply these unique values to have an impact on the rest of the world.